For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Those of you who watch this channel know that I generally consider myself an optimist. I like to think that I'm not the type to be dramatic or blow things out of proportion. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine really does have me concerned. More concerned than I have been about anything for quite some time. Now, as I'm sure you know, the situation is changing quickly. And by the time I actually post this video, conditions on the ground will likely have shifted in some way. I should also say that it's really hard to get a good grasp of just what is going on over there. There is a ton of misinformation floating around the internet, and you're never quite sure what you should believe. So be sure to take everything you hear and see regarding this conflict with a grain of salt. That said, from what I can tell right now, it looks as though Russia is struggling to actually achieve its primary goals. According to many accounts, Vladimir Putin expected the invasion to be over relatively quickly and take minimal effort. That has not panned out. As of now, the Russian army is struggling with logistical issues, low morale among their soldiers, and fierce and unexpected resistance from the Ukrainian people. In fact, as I write this, the Ukrainian army is launching counteroffensives on several fronts, and may in fact be able to surround Russian forces outside of Kiev before too long. In addition to all of that, many important and wealthy countries have taken the side of Ukraine and are providing support in various ways. Furthermore, Russia has been subjected to crippling sanctions that put them at risk of defaulting on their debt for the first time since the Russian Revolution. I don't know how this whole thing is going to turn out. Russia may be down, but they're certainly not out. This wouldn't be the first time that Russia started a war poorly only to stand victorious at the end of the day. In fact, it makes me sad to say this, but that's probably still the most likely outcome at this point. But so far, it's not going well for Putin and company. This is all good news, right? At least for me. I want the Ukrainians to win. Here's the problem, though. The worse things get for Russia, the more dangerous Vladimir Putin becomes. Consider this story that he told in his autobiography. First Person, an astonishingly frank self-portrait by Russia's president. I read the book years ago on Kindle, but I can no longer access it. So rather than reading the story to you verbatim, I'll paraphrase it to the best of my knowledge. Vladimir Putin grew up in a typical Soviet-era communal apartment in St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad. The apartment complex was infested with rats, which young Putin would bat away with a stick as he made his way up the stairs to his parents' apartment. One day, there was one particularly large, nasty rat that young Vladimir decided to chase. Putin was able to corner the rat, and upon realizing he had no way out, the rat began to attack Vladimir. Putin's takeaway from this is that someone or something is much more likely to lash out when they don't feel they have better options. And right now, Russia is a cornered rat. Putin had a similarly formative experience during his KGB days. He was stationed in the Russian Ministry of Security building in Dresden, East Germany, the night the Berlin Wall fell. German citizens surrounded the facility and started to break in, while Putin and his comrades were frantically burning documents. In desperation, they contacted Moscow for help, but they got no response. Nobody lifted a finger to protect us, Putin wrote. I got the feeling that the country no longer existed, that it had disappeared. It was clear that the Union was ailing, and it had a terminal disease without a cure, a paralysis of power. This reinforced the notion that Putin, like many other Russians, buy into, that their security is directly tied to geopolitical influence, that Russia is facing an existential crisis and is considerably more vulnerable after losing so much of its sphere of influence to the West, and this has instilled a sense of insecurity, which Vladimir Putin himself holds. While he may seem omnipotent, he lives in constant fear of losing his power. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, we've seen enormous protests within Russia itself, opposing the war. These people are incredibly brave, and I admire them more than I can say. To me, they embody all that Russia could be, and hopefully one day becomes. Make no mistake, though, Vladimir Putin does have grassroots support. The exact size of each contingent relative to the total population, I cannot say. But I do know which side is currently in power. I do know which opinion you're allowed to express in public, and which one will get you arrested. Like so many other people in other powerful nations, past and present, Russians have a sense of their nation occupying a special place in history. As Stephen Kotkin writes in Foreign Affairs, Russians have always had an abiding sense of living in a providential country with a special mission, an attitude often traced to Byzantium, which Russia claims as an inheritance. In truth, most great powers have exhibited similar feelings. Both China and the United States have claimed a heavenly mandated exceptionalism, as did England and France throughout much of their histories. Germany and Japan had their exceptionalisms bombed out of them. Russia's is remarkably resilient. It has been expressed differently over time. The Third Rome, the Pan-Slavic Kingdom, the world headquarters of the Communist International. Today's version involves Eurasianism, a movement launched among Russian emigres in 1921 that imagined Russia as neither European nor Asian but a sui generis fusion. The sense of having a special mission has contributed to Russia's paucity of formal alliances and reluctance to join international bodies except as an exceptional or dominant member. It furnishes Russian people and leaders with pride, but it also feels resentment towards the West for supposedly underappreciating Russia's uniqueness and importance. Thus is psychological alienation added to the institutional divergence driven by relative economic backwardness. As a result, Russian governments have generally oscillated between seeking closer ties with the West and recoiling in fury at perceived slights, with neither tendency able to prevail permanently. Russia very much sees itself as a superpower, and in some important ways I suppose it still is. It is geographically the largest country in the world, and arguably has more natural resources at its disposal than any of its rivals. It also has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, even larger than the United States'. Economically, though, the country is a basket case. In terms of GDP, Russia has the 11th largest economy in the world, just behind South Korea, a country with nearly a third of its population, and just a fraction of its size geographically. Think about it this way. Russia occupies 11 time zones. South Korea only occupies 1. Russia has traditionally hung its hat on its military power, even in the 21st century. But, as the Ukrainian invasion suggests, that may well be an illusion, too. Demographically, Russia is declining. Thanks in part to the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia has recently undergone the largest demographic decline in peacetime in the country's history, losing nearly 1 million people between October 2020 and September 2021. This also presents itself as a military problem, as, even with mandatory conscription, Russia has struggled to find able-bodied young men to serve in their army. There's also enormous wealth inequality on top of that, which in and of itself is not a problem, but their kleptocratic mafia economic system has ensured that the wealthy oligarchs live at the expense of regular people, who are less wealthy than your average citizen of India. Some people have pointed to these metrics and suggested that this means Russia isn't really a big concern for the United States, and that China is actually the real threat.
The Russian leader's singular vice grip over every facet of society is probably the biggest indicator of its weakness. It's not a feature of powerful, prosperous societies that the entire structure of the country is dependent on one man. If anything, it belies a national inferiority complex. Throughout history, Russia has been subjugated to many military incursions and has suffered a considerable loss in military power since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's only natural then that they would rally around a man who projects the kind of power the country itself has lost.
Russia's a crumbling nation.
And
that makes
what is
it
a
more
crumbling-
dangerous.
Yeah, what is a crumbling nation led
No,
by
it's
an
not more
autocrat
dangerous.
mafia
Russia,
boss?
With
Russia
nukes.
bleeds,
Yes.
bleeds people. It bleeds
Right.
money. And what they're trying to do is to be able to literally to be able to hold their heads up high and say, I'm proud to be a Russian. Right? That's what they're trying to do.
China is a threat, no doubt, and probably a bigger one in the long term. Unlike Russia, China is actually capable of replacing American global hegemony. Russia is a greater threat in the short run, though, precisely because it has declined in the current global order, whereas China has thrived. China is highly invested in this global order, and therefore has reason to preserve much of it, whereas Russia has every reason to upend it. Many people in Russia, including Vladimir Putin himself, long for the days of the Soviet Union, not necessarily out of some nostalgia for communism and all that comes with it, but because it was the last time their country, which was the crown jewel of the USSR, was seen to be on par with the United States as a global superpower. So given where hardliners in Russia think their country ought to be compared to how things currently stand, we can explain a lot about the current mindset. The word unhinged comes to mind. Recently, Vladimir Soloviev, one of the Kremlin's chief propagandists, has demanded that NATO leave Central Europe or Russia will invade. Putin demanded from you NATO's border and infrastructure to the state they were in 1997, nuclear weapons to the countries that own them. And if you really think that we are going to stop on Ukraine, think 300 times. I will remind you that Ukraine is only an intermediate step in providing strategic safety of the Russian Federation. Going back to the 1997 borders of NATO means that the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states, and many other countries, would be out of the alliance. Also, it's ironic that this dude is concerned about the placement of nuclear weapons, given that his country just moved nukes into Belarus. But whatever. This is alarming in its own right, but it's even more concerning given what Putin himself has said. Referring to the invasion, Putin said that all our diplomatic efforts were failing in vain. We have been left with no peaceful alternative to settle the problems that developed through no fault of ours. In this situation, we were forced to begin this special military operation. Putin adamantly insisted that this invasion was a defensive maneuver, and after listing his grievances against Western nations, he insisted that Russia will succeed. The collective West is trying to divide our society, using its own advantage, combat losses, and socio-economic consequences of the sanctions, and to provoke civil unrest in Russia and use its fifth column in an attempt to achieve this goal. As I mentioned earlier, their goal is to destroy Russia. Russia will never be seen in such a miserable and humiliated situation, and the fight we are waging is the fight for our sovereignty and the future of our country and our children. We will fight for the right to be and remain Russia. The courage and fortitude of our soldiers and officers, the faithful defenders of the fatherland, should inspire us. Putin seems to believe that all of the sanctions and aid to the Ukrainians by the West are not a response to the Kremlin's invasion of its neighbor, but are in fact an offensive attempt to destroy Russia. Pouring fuel on the fire, President Biden said this:
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
His handlers later walked back the president's statements. This is exactly the sort of thing you'd say if you were trying to sleepwalk the United States into World War III. Now, technically speaking, Putin leaving office isn't the same thing as destroying Russia. But from the perspective of Putin and many other Russians, it effectively is. Does Vladimir Putin know, like most of us do, that words just sort of fall out of Sleepy Joe's mouth? Does it matter? Does Vladimir Putin think that Biden is bluffing, and that America won't do anything more than it's currently doing? Is Putin willing to take that gamble, or will he strike first against a NATO country in anticipation that this gives his regime a better chance of survival if he thinks war is inevitable? All I know is that the more cornered Vladimir Putin feels, the more likely he is to lash out. And this is what I think of as the paradox of Russia. There are no good options for the West. If Russia faced little or no consequences for invading Ukraine, as was the case for the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the 2008 invasion of Georgia, then they're likely to feel emboldened to be more aggressive in pursuit of their geopolitical goals. But if Russia faces severe consequences, much as they have, they're likely to become more aggressive in response to the declining conditions by those consequences. I'm not sure how we should respond to all of this. Sorry to bring down the mood, but I'm genuinely not optimistic here. Stay safe, be careful, and I'll be back soon. For now, let me end this pessimistic video with some upbeat music. Take care.